Hello, and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. With cost of goods soaring and inflation at a 13-year high, many are wondering where we will go from here. The U.S. Census Bureau released district-level population data that will impact the 2022 midterm elections. Data shows that the United States has grown more diverse, and the white population has shrunk for the first time in history. Senators adopted an amendment to ban federal funding for critical race theory. The Republican amendment makes it through the Democrat majority-run Senate, along with a ban on funding for abortions. Consumer price increases slowed in July, but they remained at a 13-year high. Wednesday's report from the Labor Department showed that consumer prices jumped about 0.5% from June to July, down from the previous monthly increase of about 1%. The rate of inflation over the past year remained at 5.5% in the month of July, a 20-year high. Excluding volatile energy and food prices, so-called core inflation rose over 4% in the past year, down slightly from the month of June. This is the fastest pace since 1991. And President Biden said on Thursday at the White House, despite the progress, a lot of families are still feeling the pinch.
We're taking action to address gas prices as well. Today, gas prices are lower than they were early in this decade, but they're still high enough to create a pinch on working families. Recently, we've seen the price that oil companies pay for a barrel of oil begin to fall, but the cost of gasolines at the pump for more American people hasn't fallen.
Consumer prices remain at a 13-year high, but there are signs things are starting to level off. We spoke to Kirk Chisholm, principal at Innovative Advisory Group, to get his thoughts on inflation and things you can do to shield yourself from the effects.
See a lot of prices rising in the grocery stores. There's a lot of talk of inflation. What do you think?
That's a great question, and I love this question because people love following the hot dot, like inflation. Oh, we got to be afraid of inflation. Well, what's interesting is most people think money printing equals inflation. And I would say, well, what happened in 2008? They printed a lot of money then. We didn't have any inflation for the last 12 years. What happened, right? Well, it's not based on money printing, and it's based on the velocity money, which is really the money printing plus the velocity money, which people don't talk about. That's really the issue, is the velocity money, which has declined significantly. The reason we're having inflation, in part, is because last year it went down a lot because nobody was doing anything, right? So you were having inflation compared to that, and I don't think that surprises anybody. The big problem with inflation now is the supply chain is severely damaged, right? Look at lumber, right? Lumber went up hundreds of percent, and now it crashed 70%. Why did that happen? Well, if lumber's going up, I'm going to cut down more lumber, right? I'm going to cut down as much lumber as I can because it's high prices. And they say the cure for high prices is high prices. So I think that inflation is short-term. It's going to be temporary. I agree with the Fed. This is probably the only time I agree with the Fed, but I agree with the Fed is probably going to be transient. And once the supply chain problems have been filtered through, I think we're going to go back to a low inflation or deflationary environment.
Can you just unpack that term that you mentioned a few moments ago, velocity of money, for our viewers?
Absolutely. So the velocity of money is something you rarely hear about because it makes sense for people to talk about how we're going to have hyperinflation because all the money printing. But inflation works like this. It's if you take, let's just say you take, let's say the money supply is $1 trillion, just for sake of example. And I'm the Fed and I print up $100 quadrillion, which is a lot more, right? And I take that money and I stick it into a bank vault and I lock it. Do we have inflation? No. Because it's sitting there. Even though it technically exists, it doesn't exist in the economy because no one's using it. So just because you printed it doesn't mean we have inflation. The money has to be circulating through our economy. So the velocity of money measures that circulation through the economy. So every time you have a dollar and you spend it, that's one. If somebody else takes that and spend it, that's two. So the amount of times it circulates, that is what we call the velocity of money. So the more money that's saved, the more money that's used to pay down debt, and the more money that's just kind of sitting in cash, that lowers the velocity of money. So the fact that you're printing up all this money doesn't cause inflation because it's not actually circulating.
You said you're a gold guy. How much upside do you think gold has? It's shot up, pretty tremendously.
It's hard to tell because every asset on this planet is manipulated by central banks. Every asset. And gold is no stranger to that. I think you look at gold not for speculation, you do it for storage of wealth, which is the difference between gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is speculation, not a store of wealth. Gold is an inflation hedge historically over thousands of years, and it's something you store your wealth in. You don't expect it to make 500%. You expect it to keep pace with inflation, ideally maybe beat inflation, but your wealth is going to be preserved, right? Thousands of years ago, you could buy a gentleman's suit, which was a toga, for an ounce of gold. Today, you can use an ounce of gold and buy a gentleman's suit in London. Same thing. So it has retained its purchasing power, which is really the goal of gold.
The Democrats' $3.5 trillion budget resolution is now approved by the Senate, the first step towards signing this sweeping budget bill into law. It's trillions in extra government spending to pay for social welfare programs, immigration reform, and green energy projects. To pay for it, a tax on the wealthy. What does this mean for everyday Americans? NTD's Melina Wisecup speaks with a tax policy analyst to find out.
It'll be paid for by making our tax code more progressive and more fair.
The resolution broadly states this will happen through tax fairness for high-income individuals and IRS tax enforcement.
The problem with broad language is that it leads to a lot of interpretation, especially the Internal Revenue Service. Higher income people can afford to pay for lawyers, attorneys, CPAs, but lower income folks can't, and the IRS knows that.
That makes lower income folks more susceptible to IRS audits. Now, they also plan to raise the corporate tax. Senator Bernie Sanders has said many times that taxing the wealthy is a popular idea among Americans, since most don't think it will affect them.
And finally, we need a government that represents ordinary people, not just the wealthy campaign contributors and the 1%.
But Williams says businesses change their behaviors when they're taxed more, which in turn does impact average Americans.
They will fire people. They will have to shrink their workforce if they can't afford to keep people on payroll. So this may not be a tax increase for people, but they may lose their job because of these tax increases. And when you raise taxes on businesses, they pass along those tax increases to the consumers. So, higher prices are another form of tax.
He points to 2017 as an example, when the U.S. corporate tax was lowered from 40% to 21%. This led businesses to hiring more people and giving workers more bonuses. The corporate tax hike would also make the U.S. less competitive, since most countries' corporate tax rate is around 20 to 24%.
And although this multi-trillion-dollar budget resolution was approved in the Senate, two moderate Democrats say they're concerned about the excessive spending. Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Our congressional correspondent Melina Wisecup joins us from the Capitol with more details. So Melina, what are these moderate Democrats saying about this sweeping spending bill?
Yes, Steve, these two moderate Democrats could really stop this budget bill in its tracks. They're key votes right now. And Senator Kyrsten Sinema says she plans to negotiate a lower price tag for that $3.5 trillion budget bill. And another moderate Democrat, Senator Joe Manchin, says he has serious concerns about spending this much money at a time when the nation is in the middle of an economic recovery.
And we know Senator Manchin was the only Democrat that voted to pass an amendment to this bill, banning critical race theory from being funded by tax dollars. Melina, how did the Senate respond to this amendment overall?
Yes, Steve, so this really does show how Senator Manchin is a key vote here. Overall, the amendment passed 49 to 50, with nearly all Democrats voting against it. The amendment was introduced by Republican Senator Tom Cotton, and like you mentioned, it's to prohibit government funds from going towards teaching critical race theory in K through 12th grade schools. Now, we know critical race theory is a quasi-Marxist theory based on the premise that America is inherently racist. Now, we know that many public schools are already teaching this. Whether or not this new move by the Senate will deter those public schools from teaching it, we'll just have to see. Now, this was just adopted this week, so it'll be months before anything is officially signed into law.
Melina, there were also votes on a few other controversial topics besides critical race theory. What were some of those?
That's right, Steve. The Senate also adopted a couple of amendments regarding police funding and abortions. Now, Senator Lankford's amendment to prohibit tax dollars from funding abortions, that was adopted on a vote of 49 to 50, with Senator Joe Manchin again being the only Democrat to support it. Now, on the amendment of police funding, all Democrats came together to support a Republican amendment to hire 100,000 more officers nationwide to combat the rise in crime. This gave Democrats an opportunity to signal that they don't support defunding the police, Steve.
So along with those new amendments, the Senate has approved the budget reconciliation bill in the first procedural step. However, it still has a long way to go before officially being signed into law. For now, it's headed to the House, where they will take it up later this month. The U.S. Census Bureau today released detailed population data. States across the country use this information to draw new legislative and congressional districts. Beginning with the 2022 midterm elections, 6 states, including Texas and Florida, will gain congressional and electoral seats. Meanwhile, 7 states, including California and New York, will lose at least 1 seat. The United States has also grown more diverse. The white population has shrunk for the first time in the nation's history, while populations of other races has risen. The mixed race population has increased by roughly 270%, from 9 million to nearly 34 million. 6 states and the District of Columbia may now have majority-minority populations. With 2 members of Congress censored on Twitter and YouTube in just this week alone, we sat down with a former engineer at Google to find out if coordinated censorship at the tech giant is actually taking place. The Department of Health and Human Services now becomes the 3rd federal agency to require its employees to take the vaccine, and a study shows that 44% of employees would consider quitting their jobs if the workplace forced the vaccination. This has been an eventful week in the world of big tech when it comes to censorship. This week, 2 prominent members of Congress have been suspended from 2 major platforms. Senator Rand Paul has been censored from YouTube for referencing 2 peer-reviewed articles disputing the efficacy of cloth masks. And Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has been suspended from Twitter for her tweet challenging the efficacy of the vaccines. Congressman Rand Paul responded to the ban via video message from his Rumble account.
Recently, I shared a video on my YouTube page. It was an interview between myself and a journalist where we discussed a variety of topics, including the science behind wearing masks. Apparently, because I dared to contradict Dr. Fauci and the government, YouTube has removed my video. YouTube said the video violated their policy because of my comments on masks, and that they don't allow videos that contradict government's guidance on COVID. YouTube may be a private entity, but they're acting like an arm of the government, censoring those who present an alternative view to the science deniers in Washington.
The issue of big tech censorship has been at the forefront of the conversation in American politics for quite some time now. With the predominant left-leaning workforce in Silicon Valley, it does raise some concerns when decisions are being made to censor mostly conservative voices. We sat down with former Google engineer who blew the whistle on the tech giant and on what he said is a vast censorship apparatus singling out voices who are not in line with the company's politics. Here's our interview with Zach Voorhees, author of the new book, Google Leaks. With Zach Voorhees, the Google whistleblower. New book here, Zach. It's in the top 100 on Amazon. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Tell us what's inside of this book and what's so important to let the American people know.
So this book, Google Leaks, which you can find at googleleaksbook.com, and was #1 top 100 on Amazon this just yesterday, talks about the story about how I blew the whistle and the information that I revealed to the public. How Google ranks search results, ranks news results, ranks YouTube video. And they do this with a very specific project that they call machine learning fairness. Now, in a lot of the interviews, I don't necessarily go deep, like a slide deck presentation into exactly how Google does their stuff, but in this book, I'm able to do that. And that's the reason why I've been really excited to be able to bring this book to the American public that gives the full story on how I blew the whistle and what exactly Google was doing to the world.
Now, before we get into what this machine learning fairness is all about, tell us, how hard was it for you to come forward and risk your career and your livelihood?
Quite honestly, it tore me apart. I've been with the company for 8.5 years when I finally left. And Google treated me really well. They paid me more money than I ever expected I'd ever make. I worked really hard. I sometimes slept there. And then in 2016, when Donald Trump won the election, Google decided to do a full 180 and to go into a anti-liberty sort of bent. And I didn't quite understand why they were doing that, so I started to investigate. The reason why I investigated was because 1 week after Trump won the election, there was an all-hands meeting that Google had with the C-level executives. You can find the video on Breitbart. At the very end, there's a question by one of the employees. And the question was, to Sundar Pichai, the CEO, what was one of the most effective things that Google did in the 2016 election? And the CEO responded with, well, we were able to censor the fake news with our machine learning algorithms. And I went, wait a minute, since when has Google censored fake news? And how are we defining fake news?
That's the question.
That's the question. And so, because Google is a transparent company, once you're on the inside, a full-time engineer can go and look and see what the design documents of any other team is. And so I decided to just go ahead and just start looking and seeing what the fake news team was up to. That's when I discovered that 3 out of the 5 examples that they were using for fake news all had to do with Hillary Clinton. Now, we all have heard of Project Dragonfly, and there was like a company revolt at Google. But one of the interesting things is that when I searched for Project Dragonfly, I found that nothing ever existed. And when I found the real censorship engine, just by the name, I realized that I had stumbled upon the real deal. And the name of the censorship engine was Machine Learning Fairness. And it was massive. It was a massive, massive project that spanned several different corpuses. Google Search, Google News, YouTube videos. And I saw documents on how upper management was communicating this machine learning fairness to middle management, and also instructions on how middle management was supposed to talk about this with the engineers for these different corpuses.
Now, what would you say to somebody who's working at one of these big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, who may have something weighing on their conscience? You know, what was it that pushed you to do it, and what would you tell them?
You know, people ask me this question thinking that it took a lot of bravery to come forward. Honestly, I was terrified of revealing to myself to be a coward. I always thought of myself as like someone that would do the right thing in the time of adversity. But when it came down to it, I started seeing an ugly side of myself of going along with the system because I was feeding at the trough of this big tech company that was giving me a handsome paycheck. And I didn't want to be one of the people responsible for the downfall of America. I couldn't live with myself, knowing that I had been part of this system. And knowing that I had a unique perspective of what was really going on, I decided that I was going to expose Google, expose them to the American people, and let the American people decide what they want to do with it. And so for anyone that's on the inside that sees this evil, I tell them, record it, save as a PDF, put it onto a thumb drive, bring it to Project Veritas, they will have your back.
2 major performing arts venues in the nation's capital on Thursday announced they will be imposing vaccine mandates for audience members, performers, and the staff. The Kennedy Center and Ford's Theater announced they will be requiring audience members to be fully vaccinated. Beginning September 1st, patrons must show a government-issued photo ID and proof of full vaccination to attend all indoor performances and events at the Kennedy Center and Ford's Theater. Masking will continue to be required inside, regardless of vaccination status. Exempted patrons must provide proof of a negative test. The Kennedy Center plans to reevaluate its vaccine and masking policies on a monthly basis. And today, the Department of Health and Human Services said it will require all of its frontline workers to receive the vaccine. It is now the third federal agency to require its employees to take the vaccine, joining the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense. A study shows that 44% of employees would consider quitting their jobs if their workplace forced vaccination. This number ticked upward from 39% in March to 44% in August. But the same survey also shows that 38% of workers would consider leaving their jobs if employees don't mandate vaccines. Qualtrics surveyed a representative sample of more than 1,000 working adults. Employers may encourage or require vaccinations against the CCP virus, but policies must comply with workplace laws, according to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. If staff cannot take shots for medical reasons or sincerely held religious beliefs, employers have to make reasonable accommodations. A study done by Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh finds that people holding a PhD degree have the highest hesitancy when it comes to taking the vaccine. The study also shows they are least likely to change their minds about the issue. The Democratic National Committee kicked off its Build Back Better bus tour this morning. The tour started with an event in Virginia featuring former Democratic Governor Terry McAuliffe. He's running for governor again, seeking a second term. The tour will make stops in 10 states throughout August. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump will speak at a Save America rally in Cullman, Alabama on August 21st. The former president has recently spoke at rallies in Florida, Ohio, and Arizona. The U.S. is tightening up on Chinese companies listed on the U.S. stock market. A recent plunge in the stocks of Didi exposes the political risks of investing in Chinese companies, where the interest of Americans who invest in Chinese-based companies are at the whim of the Chinese Communist Party. A recent plunge in the stocks of Didi, a Chinese rideshare company, sheds light on the risks Americans face if they choose to invest in Chinese companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges. Now, to protect American shareholders, the SEC is requiring Chinese companies to disclose risk information about their corporate structure and how much influence the Chinese government has over companies listed in the U.S. market. The chair of the Security and Exchange Commission, or SEC, said in a statement, quote, "I believe such disclosures are crucial to informed investment decision-making and are at the heart of the SEC's mandate to protect investors in U.S. capital markets," end quote, highlighting the political risk of buying Chinese stocks that is in the interest of Americans who invest in Chinese-based companies and who are at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's something that many American investors may not know. Didi's stock plunge is the most recent example, or wake-up call. Days after Didi listed its IPO in the U.S., the Chinese government banned Didi from app stores. The CCP's cyber watchdog accused the company of illegally collecting and using personal information. After the CCP announced this measure against Didi, its shares began trading below their IPO price of $14, dropping 20%. The company lost more than $15 billion in market value in just one day. Didi is now facing multiple lawsuits by angry American shareholders since it failed to disclose its risks. SEC Chair Gary Gensler has now put a hold on processing any registrations for Chinese companies. At the same time, American investors face uncertainty about future actions by the government of China that could significantly affect the operating company's financial performance. Gensler says he worries that American investors don't know that they could be holding stock in a shell company rather than a Chinese-based operating company. Chinese companies do this because in some sectors in China, companies cannot directly list its shares on exchanges outside of China. To get around this rule, many Chinese companies are structured as variable interest entities, also known as VIEs, meaning the companies set up offshore shell companies. The shell company can then issue stock on the U.S. exchange, but the U.S. investors only own the shell company's stock and not the stocks of the operating company. So the SEC is requiring Chinese companies to disclose this fact to protect U.S. investors. And with rumors that Beijing is scrutinizing this VIE structure, many Americans who are unknowingly investing in these shell companies could face a blow to their shares. And that's all for today's Capital Report. We thank you for joining us, and if you enjoyed our show, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. I'm your host, Steve Lance. We'll see you next time.